Now to new developments tonight in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Authorities are now focusing tonight on two central pieces of evidence, including what could be that crucial DNA found in Nancy Guthrie's home.
Something inside Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law's car may decide the entire case. Because when FBI investigators finally searched the vehicle, they were not just looking for fingerprints or obvious clues. They were looking for something much smaller. Microscopic evidence that could answer the question everyone has been asking since Nancy disappeared. Did someone close to the family know more than they admitted? Or would the evidence inside that car completely clear Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law and send the investigation in a different direction? Sources say the FBI carefully examined every part of the vehicle, the seats, the trunk, even areas most drivers never think about. Because in criminal investigations, cars often become silent witnesses. They carry traces people cannot see. And whatever the FBI found inside that vehicle could do one of two things: turn Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law into the most important suspect in the case, or remove his name from the investigation entirely. Subscribe this channel. Now, let's look at why investigators believe the vehicle might hold the answer. In investigations like the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, detectives often reach a moment when the focus shifts from people to objects, phones, clothing, and sometimes vehicles. Because cars move quietly through the story of a crime. They travel between locations, they carry people, and sometimes they carry something else without the driver even realizing it: evidence. That is why investigators eventually turn their attention toward the vehicle belonging to Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law. At first, the search was routine. When someone close to a case becomes part of the timeline surrounding a disappearance, detectives often examine anything that might confirm where that person was and what they were doing. But vehicles hold a unique importance. They can contain traces that remain long after a person believes everything has been cleaned. Fibers from clothing, microscopic particles from soil or plants, even tiny amounts of biological evidence that cannot be seen with the human eye. Forensic teams know exactly where to look for these details: inside seat seams, under floor mats, in the trunk, and in the hidden corners where objects might be placed briefly before being removed. When FBI investigators began examining the son-in-law's car, they were not only looking for signs of a crime, they were also searching for something equally important: proof that nothing unusual had ever been inside that car at all. Because in cases like this, the evidence found inside a car can move an investigation in two completely different directions. It can raise serious suspicion, or it can quietly eliminate someone from the list of people investigators need to focus on. And that is exactly why the search of this vehicle became such a critical moment in the Nancy Guthrie investigation. Because whatever the FBI found inside that car had the potential to answer a question detectives had been asking from the beginning. Was someone close to Nancy involved, or was suspicion about the son-in-law leading investigators in the wrong direction? When investigators examine a vehicle connected to a serious case, they do not search it the way most people would expect. They are not simply opening doors and looking around. A forensic vehicle search is slow, methodical, and extremely detailed. Specialists begin by documenting every part of the car. Photographs are taken from multiple angles. The position of seats, mirrors, and personal items is recorded exactly as they were found. Even the smallest object inside the vehicle could become important later in the investigation. After that, the real forensic work begins. Investigators use special lighting tools that reveal substances invisible under normal light: blood traces, biological fluids, fibers from clothing, even tiny particles of soil that may have been carried inside on shoes. Each of those traces can help detectives reconstruct movements connected to the vehicle, where it may have traveled, who may have been inside it, and whether something unusual occurred during the time investigators are trying to understand. In the case of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the son-in-law's vehicle became particularly important because detectives were still trying to map the timeline of the night Nancy vanished. If the car had been used to travel somewhere unexpected, or if something connected to Nancy appeared inside it, that discovery could completely change the direction of the investigation. But there was another possibility investigators had to consider as well. The search could reveal nothing at all. And sometimes finding nothing can be just as important as discovering evidence. Because in high-profile cases, suspicion can grow quickly around people closest to the victim. A careful forensic search can either confirm those suspicions or quietly begin removing them. Which is why investigators knew the results of this forensic search would carry enormous weight in the Nancy Guthrie case. As forensic teams worked through the son-in-law's vehicle, investigators were hoping to answer several critical questions. The first involved location. Cars often collect tiny fragments from places they travel: dust, sand, plant material. These particles may seem insignificant, but forensic analysts can sometimes trace them back to specific environments. If the vehicle had been driven somewhere connected to Nancy's disappearance, those microscopic fragments could provide the first clue. The second question involved biological evidence. DNA can remain in a vehicle long after an event has taken place. Hair strands, skin cells, even traces left behind during brief contact. Forensic specialists carefully examine seat fabric, door handles, and areas where someone may have held on to surfaces. And finally, investigators examined the trunk. Because in many criminal cases, the trunk becomes one of the most important areas of a vehicle. Not because it always contains obvious evidence, but because it can hold traces from objects that were placed there temporarily: a bag, clothing, or something that was moved from one location to another. Detectives knew that if anything connected to Nancy Guthrie had passed through that vehicle, even briefly, the forensic examination might reveal it. But investigators were also aware of something equally important. If the search produced no meaningful evidence at all, it could significantly weaken the theory that the son-in-law's vehicle had any connection to Nancy's disappearance, which meant the results of this forensic search would do something very powerful. They would either tighten suspicion around someone close to the case or force investigators to look in an entirely different direction. As the forensic examination continued, investigators eventually reached the part of the vehicle that often attracts the most attention in cases like this: the trunk. In many investigations, the trunk becomes a silent record of where a vehicle has been and what it may have carried. It collects fibers, dust, and small fragments from anything placed inside it. Even objects that remain there for a short time can leave traces behind. Because of that, forensic teams treat the trunk area with extreme care. They begin by photographing every surface: the floor lining, the spare tire compartment, the side panels where small items can sometimes be hidden. Only after documenting the entire space do they begin collecting samples. Investigators use adhesive lifts to gather microscopic fibers. They vacuum certain areas with specialized filters designed to capture tiny particles.
Every sample is carefully labeled and sent to a forensic laboratory for analysis. In the case of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, detectives knew the trunk examination could answer an important question: had anything unusual been transported inside that vehicle? Even if an object had been removed later, traces could remain: fibers from clothing, particles from soil, or biological material invisible to the naked eye. For investigators, the trunk represented one of the best chances of discovering whether the vehicle had been used in connection with the crime. But it also carried another possibility. The trunk might reveal nothing suspicious at all. And if that happened, it would create a very different conclusion. Because in a case surrounded by speculation, a completely clean forensic result could begin to remove one of the most talked about names from the investigation entirely. Once investigators finished collecting samples from the vehicle, the most important part of the process had only just begun: the laboratory analysis. Because the evidence gathered from a car does not immediately answer questions on its own. Fibers, dust, DNA, traces, all of it must be examined carefully under controlled conditions before investigators can understand what it means. Each sample taken from the son-in-law's vehicle was sealed and sent to forensic specialists. Inside the lab, technicians began comparing the materials collected from the car with evidence already gathered earlier in the Nancy Guthrie investigation. That comparison is critical in cases like this. If a fiber inside the vehicle matches fabric from clothing connected to Nancy, investigators immediately know that object may have been inside the car at some point. If soil particles match the environment near a location investigators are studying, it could suggest the vehicle traveled there. And if biological evidence appears that belongs to Nancy herself, the implications would be impossible to ignore. But forensic testing can also produce the opposite result. Samples may show no connection to the crime at all. In that situation, investigators must reconsider their assumptions, because the absence of evidence inside the vehicle would suggest that whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie may have occurred without the son-in-law's car ever being involved, which means the laboratory results would carry enormous weight, not just for investigators trying to solve the case, but for determining whether suspicions surrounding Nancy's son-in-law would grow stronger or begin to disappear entirely. As the laboratory continued analyzing the samples collected from the vehicle, investigators focused on one possibility that could instantly shift the direction of the case: transfer evidence. In forensic investigations, transfer evidence refers to the tiny materials that move from one surface to another during contact. A fiber from a jacket can attach to a car seat. A strand of hair can fall onto the floor mat. A trace of soil from a specific location can cling to the bottom of a shoe and later appear inside a vehicle. These details are often invisible to the human eye, but under laboratory examination, they can reveal where a person has been and what they may have come into contact with. In the Nancy Guthrie investigation, analysts began comparing every particle found inside the son-in-law's car with the evidence collected from Nancy's home and the surrounding area. They were looking for even the smallest connection: a fiber that matched clothing, plant fragments from the environment near the house, or any biological trace that could place Nancy inside the vehicle at some point during the timeline investigators were studying. If even one of those matches appeared, the implications would be enormous, because it would suggest the car had been involved in events connected to Nancy's disappearance. But investigators were equally prepared for another outcome: the possibility that no such connection would appear at all. And if the laboratory analysis showed that none of the materials inside the vehicle matched the evidence from Nancy's home, detectives would have to reconsider one of the most discussed theories surrounding the case: that the son-in-law's car had anything to do with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance.
While the forensic analysis continued, investigators began preparing for two very different outcomes, because the results from the laboratory would not simply add information to the case, they would likely reshape it. If the evidence from the son-in-law's vehicle matched anything connected to Nancy Guthrie, the implications would be immediate. Detectives would have to ask why that connection existed, how Nancy or objects connected to her could have ended up inside the vehicle, and whether that meant someone close to the family had been involved in events surrounding her disappearance. But investigators also knew another result was entirely possible. The laboratory might find nothing linking the car to Nancy at all. No fibers, no biological traces, no environmental particles that matched the location where she was last seen. In that situation, the conclusion would be very different. It would suggest the vehicle played no role in whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie that night. And if that were true, it would remove one of the most talked about suspicions surrounding the case. Because in high-profile investigations, the people closest to the victim are often examined first, not because they are automatically responsible, but because investigators must eliminate every possibility before moving forward. The evidence inside that vehicle, therefore, carried enormous weight. It had the power to intensify suspicion around Nancy's son-in-law, or it could quietly clear his name and force detectives to search somewhere else entirely for the truth about what happened to Nancy Guthrie. As the forensic testing continued, investigators knew they were approaching one of the most critical moments in the entire Nancy Guthrie investigation, because laboratory results do something powerful in criminal cases. They remove speculation. Until that moment, the discussion surrounding Nancy's son-in-law's vehicle had been built mostly on questions. Why was the car important? Could it have been used during the time Nancy disappeared? Was it possible that something connected to Nancy had been inside it? But forensic evidence has a way of turning questions into answers. Inside the laboratory, analysts began examining the materials collected from the vehicle one by one. Each fiber was studied under magnification. Each particle of dust or soil was compared with environmental samples collected earlier by investigators. Even the smallest biological traces were processed using DNA analysis techniques capable of identifying microscopic skin cells left behind during brief contact. The process takes time, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, because laboratories must confirm results carefully before investigators can rely on them. But detectives knew that whatever the lab eventually reported could dramatically shift the investigation. If the results showed that something connected to Nancy Guthrie had been inside the vehicle, the implications would be impossible to ignore. That would mean the car had been present during events connected to her disappearance. It would raise new questions about how that connection occurred, and it would almost certainly intensify scrutiny around the son-in-law and his movements during the hours surrounding Nancy's disappearance. Investigators would then begin reconstructing the timeline again. Where had the vehicle traveled? Who had access to it? And whether any surveillance cameras or digital records could confirm those movements. But there was another possibility detectives had to prepare for. The possibility that the laboratory might find no connection between the vehicle and Nancy Guthrie at all. No matching fibers, no biological traces, no environmental evidence linking the car to locations investigators were studying. In that situation, something equally important would happen. The theory surrounding the son-in-law's vehicle would begin to collapse, because forensic evidence is not just about finding proof of involvement. It is also about ruling people out. If the vehicle showed no signs of contact with Nancy or objects connected to her disappearance, investigators would have to reconsider the role that car played in the case. And that would force detectives to focus their attention somewhere else, toward other leads, other timelines, other individuals who may have crossed paths with Nancy during the critical hours before she vanished. Which is why investigators understood the weight of those laboratory results. They were not simply testing samples from a car. They were examining evidence that could reshape the entire investigation, either by strengthening suspicion around someone close to the family or by clearing one of the most discussed figures in the case. And until those results were fully confirmed, one question remained hanging over the entire investigation. What exactly had the FBI discovered inside that vehicle, and what would it ultimately reveal about the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared? By the time investigators completed the forensic examination of Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law's vehicle, the car had quietly become one of the most important pieces of the entire investigation. Not because a vehicle can tell investigators what happened, but because cars often carry the smallest fragments of a story, fragments that people never realize they leave behind. Fibers trapped in seat seams, particles of soil pressed into floor mats, microscopic traces that remain long after someone believes everything has been removed. That is why FBI forensic teams approached the vehicle with extreme care. Every section of the car was documented, every surface examined, every particle collected and sent for analysis. Because in cases involving disappearances, vehicles can sometimes reveal movements that investigators cannot see anywhere else. Where someone may have traveled, what objects may have been transported, and whether something connected to the missing person ever passed through that space. For detectives working the Nancy Guthrie case, the search of the son-in-law's vehicle was never about one single clue. It was about narrowing the truth. Investigations often begin with many possibilities, different theories, different timelines, different people who may have had contact with the victim before they disappeared. But as evidence begins to emerge, those possibilities slowly become smaller. Certain theories begin to collapse, others grow stronger. The vehicle search was part of that process. If forensic testing discovered traces connected to Nancy inside the car, investigators would immediately begin rebuilding the timeline around that discovery. They would examine when the vehicle had been used, where it may have traveled, and whether any surveillance cameras, digital records, or witness statements could confirm those movements. That kind of evidence could dramatically shift the direction of the case. But investigators were also prepared for a completely different result, the possibility that the vehicle contained nothing connected to Nancy at all. No fibers, no biological traces, no environmental material linking the car to locations detectives were examining. And if that happened, something equally important would occur. The theory surrounding the son-in-law's vehicle would begin to fade, because forensic evidence does not only identify suspects, it can also eliminate them. Removing someone from suspicion allows investigators to focus their attention somewhere else, toward other people, other locations, other moments in the timeline that may have gone unnoticed before. That is the difficult reality of investigations like this. The truth rarely appears all at once. It emerges slowly, one piece of evidence at a time. For now, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie remains a mystery investigators are still trying to solve. Detectives continue reviewing forensic reports, examining digital data, following leads that might explain what happened during the critical hours before Nancy vanished. And somewhere within that growing body of evidence lies the answer everyone is searching for. Did the discovery inside the son-in-law's vehicle reveal something investigators had been looking for, or will the case ultimately lead detectives somewhere completely unexpected? Until that answer becomes clear, the investigation continues.
And with every new piece of evidence, investigators move one step closer to understanding what truly happened the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Subscribe to This